February 26, 1944. 25,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The air is a frozen sea of smoke trails and burning metal. A formation of American B-17s pushes east through flak bursts that look like black flowers blooming in the sky. Each one is the size of a truck. Each one wants blood. Inside one of those bombers, a battered flying fortress named Sweet Sally. 10 men fight to stay alive. Oxygen masks crackle, engines rattle. The smell of cordite and oil fills the cabin. At the waist gun position stands Staff Sergeant William Wild Bill Tucker, his flight jacket half-zipped, his goggles fogged. He's sweating hard despite the cold, a flask still wedged in his flight vest. The crew swears he'd been drinking before takeoff. They joked about it. No one's laughing now. The bomber lurches hard left as cannon fire rips through the formation. German fighters are closing, 30 of them, maybe more. FW-190s and Me-109s diving from the sun, spitting 20mm rounds into the wave of American planes. Tucker braces his boots, plants his hands on the twin 50s, and grins through chapped lips. "Come on, you bastards," he mutters, words slurred through adrenaline. The first German fighter dives head-on. Tucker opens up. Tracers arc through the sky like burning rope. The rhythm of the guns is deafening. A mechanical drumbeat that vibrates through his chest. The rounds find their mark. The fighter explodes in orange light, fragments whipping past the bomber's wings. The intercom crackles with shouts. "Waist gun! You got one! You got one!" But there's no time to celebrate. Another fighter slices in from below. Cannon shells tearing through the fuselage. Tucker's glass shatters. He ducks, then fires blind, following only the trail of the tracers. The Me-109's engine erupts in flame. The plane spirals past the window, trailing smoke. That's two. The bombardier is yelling something over the intercom. The pilot can't hear. The left engine's hit. The formation's breaking apart. Tucker reloads with shaking hands. Blood from his knuckles mixes with gun oil. He's laughing now, not out of joy, but survival. The laughter of someone whose nerves have burned away. Another FW-190 comes in low, climbing for a kill shot. Tucker fires long, too long, but the rounds walk their way up into the cockpit. A burst of sparks. The fighter rolls, breaks, and disappears into the cloud layer. 3. The rest of the crew stares in disbelief. The drunk is carving the sky open. By the time they cross back over the Rhine, Tucker's guns are smoking. 5 kills confirmed. The bomber, torn and bleeding, somehow makes it home. When they land in England, the crew climbs out in silence. Tucker sits on the wing, breathing hard, eyes red, hands trembling. The smell of whiskey and cordite lingers in the cold air. Nobody says a word. They just know one thing. That day, madness outgunned precision, and the sky will never forget it. When word spread through the base, it sounded like a bad joke that happened to be true. The drunk waist gunner from the 401st had downed 5 fighters in one mission. The mess hall buzzed with laughter, disbelief, and half-serious envy. Someone scrawled "Whiskey Wing Ace" on the chalkboard. Pilots joked that they should issue bourbon with the ammunition. But beneath the humor was something else. Confusion. How could a man everyone thought reckless have been the calmest one in the sky? The official debrief tried to flatten the story. Reports filed it under unusual effectiveness under duress. Officers whispered that Tucker's reflexes must have been a lucky fluke, the same kind of mad chance that sometimes saved a man when logic said he was already dead. But the airmen knew better. The skies over Germany had a way of exposing truth faster than any psychologist. Training built habits, yes, but only instinct survived contact with fear. Discipline could get you killed if it meant freezing for half a second too long. Tucker hadn't been drunk that day to escape duty. He'd been trying to calm the one thing training couldn't fix, the knowledge that every second in the air was borrowed time. By 1944, the waist gunner's position was the worst job in the 8th Air Force. Exposed, narrow, and deafening. No armor, no cover, no mercy. When enemy fighters made their run, Waist gunners were the first hit and the first to die. Tucker knew it. Every man did. Out of the 10 who boarded Sweet Sally that morning, statistical math said at least 2 wouldn't come back. He'd seen too many friends freeze at the sight of tracers. Hesitation was death. So he'd found his own cure for it. A flask of rye and a mind that didn't wait to think. The officers called it recklessness. The men called it something else, the rare kind of madness that made survival possible. For the rest of the squadron, Tucker became a myth, the symbol of what nobody wanted to admit, that sometimes the difference between panic and precision wasn't courage. It was chaos. Psychologists would later describe the phenomenon, hyperfocus under duress. The body floods itself with adrenaline, narrowing vision, sharpening reaction time. It's the opposite of discipline. But in war, it works. That's what happened at 25,000 feet. Tucker didn't aim like a trained marksman. He reacted like an animal, faster than thought, beyond fear. The gunfire had been pure instinct, no conscious correction, no mechanical calculation, just pulse, sound, and motion. The Air Force couldn't explain it. The manual couldn't teach it. But every man who saw it that day knew one thing for certain. The drunk didn't get lucky. He just stopped pretending that survival was rational. By early 1944, the skies over Germany had become the most lethal airspace on Earth. Every mission flown by the 8th Air Force was a coin toss with death. They called it the Great Daylight Gamble, because that's what it was. Broad daylight bombing raids deep into enemy territory with no guarantee of return. The concept was bold, almost arrogant. Precision bombing. America would strike factories, refineries, and transport hubs with surgical accuracy. No night raids, no guessing, just raw daylight, formation flying, and faith in the B-17 Flying Fortress, a plane built to take punishment and keep flying. But the math told another story. Each B-17 carried 10 men, 4 engines, 12 50-caliber machine guns, and 8,000 pounds of bombs. The missions were flown in tight formations of 100 or more aircraft, massive silver grids crawling across the stratosphere. It looked unstoppable. It wasn't. German radar tracked them from the moment they crossed the channel. Flak batteries lined the industrial corridor from Bremen to Munich. And when the bombers reached 25,000 feet, the Luftwaffe was waiting. FW-190s and Me-109s attacked in coordinated waves, diving head-on, using the sun to blind the gunners. Each carried 20mm cannons that could rip through a B-17's fuselage in seconds. The average survival odds? 26%. That meant for every 4 bombers that took off, only 1 could expect to finish a full tour of 25 missions. The rest would burn, crash, or vanish into the clouds. Waist gunners like Tucker had the most exposed job of all. They stood between 2 open windows, one on each side of the fuselage, firing twin Brownings into the slipstream. The cold could freeze a man's hands to the handles. At altitude, oxygen lines froze, metal cracked, and frostbite bit deeper than fear. Each mission lasted 8 hours. Each second under attack felt like eternity. Tucker had already flown 16 sorties before Schweinfurt. He'd watched crews disappear into black smoke and flame. He'd seen parachutes fail to open, heard men screaming over the intercom as planes broke apart. You didn't sleep between missions. You drank, you smoked, you prayed, or you didn't. He wasn't alone in that. The U.S. Army Air Force's new morale was a battle all its own. Whiskey became a more common currency than medals. Doctors quietly ignored breath tests before takeoff. Commanders understood what statistics already proved. A calm drunk could shoot straighter than a sober corpse. The bombers were supposed to symbolize invincibility. Instead, they became flying coffins of courage, each mission a bet that 10 men and 12 guns could outlast the sky itself. And for a few minutes over Schweinfurt, one of those men, bleary-eyed, half-numb, and wholly alive, did more than just survive. He rewrote what it meant to stay human inside a machine designed to die. Because in those days, courage didn't come clean. It came shaking, sweating, and smelling of gun oil and rye. Every mission began with the same ritual: briefing at dawn, black coffee, and the math of mortality. The men of the 8th Air Force didn't just fly against the Luftwaffe. They flew against arithmetic. A B-17 raid into Germany meant 10 men per plane, 2,780 gallons of fuel, 8,000 pounds of bombs, and roughly 12,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. That was the system's promise: precision, persistence, power. But the numbers that mattered most were the ones no one wrote down. Loss rate: 1 bomber out of every 5. Average lifespan of a waist gunner: 14 missions. Average chance of finishing a full 25-mission tour: 1 in 4. Every time a crew gathered around a chalkboard to hear their target, someone in the room knew it was his last. The odds didn't lie. The air war over Europe was statistical slaughter. Between 1942 and 1945, 65,000 American airmen were killed or captured. The 8th Air Force alone lost more men than the entire U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. And yet, every morning, the sky filled again. It took 11 man-hours of ground labor for every hour of flight, 40,000 maintenance workers to keep the fleet alive, and 1,000 replacement airmen each month to fill the empty bunks. The logistics were staggering. The bravery was routine. To the crews, the math became superstition. Some carried lucky coins, others wore wedding rings around their necks. Tucker kept his luck bottled. A half-pint of rye tucked in his flight vest. He said it kept his hands from freezing. The truth was simpler. It kept his mind from thinking. The flak gunners below didn't care about luck. Each shell weighed 20 pounds and exploded with razor shards that could tear through steel. A single burst could cripple a bomber. Hundreds exploded every minute. The sound of flak wasn't just noise, it was a heartbeat. The waist gunner's world was measured in seconds and inches. At 250 miles per hour, a fighter flashed across his window in 2 seconds flat. He had to spot, aim, and fire in less than 1. Every missed burst was another German pilot making his second pass. Tucker didn't calculate those odds. He outshouted them. His gunnery log shows 1,200 rounds fired that day, nearly everyone from instinct. His hits weren't precision, they were persistence. That was the secret the manuals never printed. The human nervous system was faster than the math. The air war was supposed to be mechanical. Factories of steel fighting factories of men. But up there, inside those glass cages, survival wasn't statistical. It was animal. Every trigger pull was an argument against inevitability. Every burst of tracers was a heartbeat saying, "Not yet." And that's what made Tucker's feat so impossible. Not the number of kills, but the fact that he was still alive to count them. Because at 25,000 feet, in the cold logic of the air war, men didn't survive because they were perfect. They survived because they refused to let probability decide when they stopped firing. The briefing that morning was quiet. Schweinfurt again, the worst word a bomber crew could hear. The German city wasn't just another target. It was where the Reich made its ball bearings, the tiny gears that kept every tank, plane, and truck moving. To the generals, destroying it was vital. To the airmen, it was suicide. At 0800, the formation lifted off from England. 400 B-17s rising through cloud, their engines thundering in chorus. The sky over the channel was calm, deceptive, like a breath before drowning. At 22,000 feet, Tucker checked his guns. The twin Brownings sat cold, their belts of brass cartridges coiled like serpents. He could feel the hangover pulsing behind his eyes, the dull ache from a night of too much whiskey and too little sleep. He pulled the flask from his vest, took a sip, and grinned. "For luck," he muttered. 2 hours in, they crossed into Germany. The radio filled with static and fear. Black puffs of flak appeared ahead, perfectly spaced, as if drawn by geometry. The Germans had learned to calculate altitude from contrails. The bombers shook violently. Fragments punched through the fuselage, slicing holes the size of fists. Tucker ducked as glass shattered across his shoulders. He could smell burning paint, hot oil, and cordite, the scent of a sky on fire. Then came the fighters. A swarm of FW-190s appeared out of the sun, diving straight into the formation. The first hit tore into a neighboring plane, snapping its wing clean off. The bomber fell like a broken star. Tucker swung his guns, tracking shadows across the clouds. His eyes were red, his hands steady. He didn't think. He reacted. A German fighter flashed across his window, barely visible. Tucker squeezed the triggers. The 50s roared, the barrels glowing. He saw the fighter's cockpit erupt in flame. 1. A second FW-190 pulled up from below, cannon fire rattling through the tail. Tucker pivoted and fired long bursts until smoke poured from its engine. 2. The intercom screamed with overlapping voices. Tail gunner wounded, radio out, right engine hit. The pilot shouted for updates. Tucker didn't answer. He was laughing, the sound raw, almost feral. "Come on! Come on!" Another Mi-109 darted through the formation, guns flashing. Tucker led it by instinct, not training, just feeling the rhythm of its path. The fighter exploded midair, wings spinning away like blades. 3. Now the sky was chaos, burning bombers, parachutes, trails of smoke crossing in every direction. Tucker fired until the barrels smoked. He slapped another ammo belt in, ignoring the blood dripping from his hand. A fourth German came in from dead astern. Tucker held the trigger down. No bursts, no discipline. Just continuous fire until the gun bucked in his hands. The fighter disintegrated in front of him. 4. The last one dove too close. Tucker waited on one breath, then another, before unleashing everything left. His tracers walked straight into the belly of the FW-190. The explosion lit up the fuselage in orange fire. 5. The intercom went dead quiet. Even the pilot said nothing. Tucker looked around at the empty sky, breathing hard, smoke curling around his shoulders. When Sweet Sally limped home hours later, 2 engines were gone, a third barely holding. 187 holes in the fuselage. Half the instruments shot out. But the crew was alive. On the ground, officers asked how he'd done it. Tucker just shrugged. Didn't aim, just listened. He wasn't lying. At 25,000 feet, with death on all sides, the only sound louder than the guns had been the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The after-action reports came back in disbelief. 5 confirmed kills, hundreds of rounds expended, 1 bomber limping home against the odds. To the officers, the story didn't make sense. The waist gunner was supposed to be a liability. Undisciplined, reckless, possibly drunk. But the gun camera footage and the ballistic patterns on recovered wreckage didn't lie. His aim had been perfect. The contradiction bothered everyone. How could a man so apparently careless be so effective? The manuals preached precision. Every training film insisted on short, controlled bursts. Every instructor drilled the same rhythm. 3 seconds, correct, adjust. Tucker had ignored all of it. He'd fired long, dirty streams of fire, the kind that jammed guns, burned barrels, and wasted ammo. But the kind that killed. The truth, as the doctors later confirmed, was physiology. Under extreme stress, the human brain stops thinking linearly. Blood leaves the frontal cortex, the reasoning part, and floods the reflex centers. Time slows. Reaction speeds double. For most men, that causes panic. For a few, it triggers a strange calm, the same clarity that fighter pilots called the bubble. Tucker had found that bubble by accident. The alcohol dulled his fear just enough to keep him there. His mind wasn't racing, it was empty, mechanical, instinctive. Where others froze, he flowed. In the bomber war, discipline was supposed to save you. In practice, it got you killed. German pilots flew with mathematical precision, high-speed passes, tight formations, rehearsed angles. They'd trained for order. But combat wasn't orderly. It was violent probability. Tucker didn't outthink them. He out-chaosed them. His unpredictability broke their geometry. Psychologists would later describe it as stochastic survival, thriving in randomness. Every time he ignored protocol, he added a degree of unpredictability the Luftwaffe couldn't counter. It wasn't luck. It was anti-pattern warfare before anyone knew what that was. The officers wanted to make sense of it. They wrote reports full of cautious praise and bureaucratic hedging. Demonstrated exceptional initiative under fire, one said. Another simply noted, effectiveness beyond expectation. But the men on base understood the truth better than any report. You could train someone to aim, but not to let go. Tucker had done what machines couldn't. He turned chaos into accuracy. He wasn't the only one. Across the war, similar stories surfaced. Tail gunners who fired blind and hit unseen targets. Pilots who survived by violating every rule. Each case suggested the same quiet truth. Perfection dies faster than improvisation. The Army Air Forces didn't change doctrine overnight, but the lesson lingered. Later manuals added a line. Under sustained assault, continuous fire may disrupt enemy attack patterns. That was bureaucratic code for what Tucker already knew. Hesitation is fatal. When you're outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by fire, precision stops mattering. Only flow remains. He didn't win because he was better. He won because he stopped caring whether he was. And sometimes, that's all survival really is. The moment instinct outruns fear. The B-17 was built for punishment. It was called the Flying Fortress for a reason. 4 engines, self-sealing tanks, armor plates, and 12 heavy machine guns. But that day over Schweinfurt, Sweet Sally looked more like a flying skeleton than a fortress. By the time she crossed the Rhine on the return leg, 2 engines were gone. The third sputtered, coughing blue smoke. Hydraulic pressure had bled to 0. The radio operator was working one-handed, the other wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. The tail gunner was unconscious from shrapnel loss. The waist section, Tucker's station, was riddled with holes. You could see daylight through the fuselage in 50 places. Oxygen masks dangled in tatters. Every piece of metal hissed, burned, or leaked. And yet, the plane flew. That was the miracle of the B-17. A machine designed not to avoid damage, but to survive it. Its engineers had calculated redundancy into every part. If a wing was torn, the other could lift. If a line was cut, there was another path. It was a bomber that turned damage into drag, not destruction. But even the most durable machine needs belief to keep it moving. The pilot, Lieutenant Harris, later said he wanted to bail. The controls were stiff, the fuel low, and the compass was spinning like a carnival wheel. We were dead on paper, he recalled, but Tucker was still laughing. Somehow that laughter kept the crew in their seats. The gunner who'd fired his barrels red hot was still pacing, still yelling, still watching the sky through shattered glass. The rest of the men fed off that noise, the manic defiance of a man who refused to die quietly. Over the channel, they hit another wall of flak. The bomber shuddered. Rivets popped like gunshots. But Tucker was already at the right window, returning fire with the single gun that still worked. The belts were almost empty. He didn't care. Minutes later, the white cliffs of Dover appeared through the haze. Engines 1 and 2 finally quit. The pilot trimmed the controls, leveled the wings, and coaxed the plane down in a long, trembling glide. They landed hard, tires shredded. One wing scraped the ground. The fortress skidded for nearly half a mile before coming to rest in a field outside the airstrip. Smoke poured from the nose. When the fire crews reached them, they found the 10 men sitting silently inside the wreckage. The engines ticked in the cooling air. Nobody spoke. Then Tucker broke the quiet. "Hell of a morning, boys." The crew climbed out one by one. The aircraft had 187 visible holes. Half of its control cables were severed. Engineers said it should never have flown another minute. The next day, mechanics painted a name on the nose in fresh yellow letters, Lucky Bastard 2. It became a legend in the squadron, not for what it bombed, but for what it endured. Because that mission proved something terrifying and beautiful, that a bomber could be built to absorb chaos. But it took humans like Tucker to keep its heart beating inside the storm. And in that sense, Sweet Sally wasn't just a plane. It was the closest thing the war ever made to resurrection. When Sweet Sally limped back to base, the mission logs listed her as probable loss. Nobody expected survivors. The ground crew stood frozen as the bomber rolled to a stop, engines coughing out smoke. The men looked like ghosts stepping out of hell. The debrief came that night. A dozen officers crammed into a small wooden room smelling of coffee and fuel. Tucker sat at the end of the table, flight jacket still on, cigarette trembling between his fingers. He looked more like a man coming off a bender than a hero. The first questions were procedural. Altitude, attack vector, rate of fire. He answered with short, flat words. He didn't remember much, he said. Just light and noise. Then the operations officer cut in. You're claiming 5 kills. Do you understand what that means? Tucker blinked. Means I'm still here. The room went silent. They played the gun camera footage. Black and white, grainy, chaotic. Flashes of tracers. A German fighter bursts into flame. Another disintegrates mid-turn. The hits are clean, deliberate, impossible. The ballistic analysts later confirmed every one of them. It wasn't luck. The gunners' arcs were too consistent. The lead perfect, the timing flawless. Tucker's firing rate never dipped below 400 rounds per minute. He didn't aim by sight. He aimed by rhythm. When the footage ended, one of the engineers leaned forward. What were you thinking when you fired? Tucker exhaled a thin stream of smoke. Didn't think. Just felt where they'd be. The men around the table looked at each other. It sounded like nonsense. But in that nonsense was something revolutionary. The next month, a quiet report circulated through Air Force Training Command. Case study, adaptive gunner response under mass assault. It rewrote small parts of doctrine. Paragraph 4B. Controlled bursts under extreme pressure are less effective. Continuous fire, if sustained with correctional instinct, increases deterrence and hit probability. In plain English, Tucker's madness worked. The manual writers never mentioned his name. The credit went to field observation. But across the 8th Air Force, instructors began repeating a new phrase. Don't think, feel the pattern. Pilots noticed it too. The waist gunners who trained after Schweinfurt fired faster, moved freer. They learned to anticipate motion, not measure it. The legend spread quietly. Some called him the drunk who shot straight. Others said he was half insane. Either way, they wanted his luck. Back in England, Tucker received a Distinguished Flying Cross. He didn't attend the ceremony. His crew accepted it for him. He stayed in the barracks, cleaning his guns, staring at the metal that had kept him alive. In the official record, his story is a footnote. No interviews, no photographs. Just one mission log with 5 X's marked under enemy aircraft destroyed. But inside the Air Force archives, tucked between rows of mission summaries, one typed note remains. Sergeant W.B. Tucker demonstrated that discipline is a tool. Survival is an instinct. No one ever saw him again after the war. He disappeared into the quiet America that victory built. Gas stations, factories, small bars filled with veterans who spoke in half sentences. But the system he defied absorbed his chaos. And somewhere between the lines of a doctrine manual, the U.S. Army quietly admitted that sometimes the best way to win a war is to fight like you've already died. In the sanitized language of the official report, Tucker's name fades into statistics. 5 confirmed kills. 1 damaged bomber returned. 10 survivors. But beneath those sterile numbers lies a contradiction that no military system likes to face. That the man who broke every rule embodied the very reason those rules existed. War loves order. Armies thrive on it. Manuals teach repetition, discipline, obedience. But the truth of aerial combat in 1944 was far from orderly. The sky was chaos, a three-dimensional hurricane of lead, fire, and fear. And chaos doesn't care about protocol. Tucker's 5 kills weren't a miracle. They were the natural outcome of unfiltered reaction. His chaos fit the chaos around him. Where disciplined men froze in the storm, he became part of it. Commanders couldn't write that in a manual. They couldn't tell airmen to let go. But they could quietly reshape doctrine to include what he'd proven, that the human nervous system, unshackled from logic, could outperform training when death moved faster than thought. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He wasn't noble, clean, or sober. He was raw humanity under pressure, the part of every soldier that operates when everything else shuts down. The men who flew with him understood. They stopped calling him the drunk. They called him the one who listened to the guns. That phrase spread, whispered among bomber crews. It became a kind of superstition. Trust your guns, not your mind. The Browning 50s had their own rhythm, their own heartbeat. When you stopped forcing it, when you just listened, the hits came. There's a strange poetry in that. The same man dismissed as reckless ended up embodying the very soul of the air war. Imperfect men using imperfect machines to create something like precision. And it wasn't just him. Every theater had its versions. The pilot who turned too hard, the engineer who bypassed a safety, the sergeant who disobeyed orders to save his crew. History celebrates perfection, but survival in war depends on deviation. Tucker's drunken shooting reminded everyone that the machine could never replace the man. His chaos wasn't weakness. It was the hidden strength that order could never simulate. The reminder that courage doesn't always look clean, and instinct isn't the opposite of discipline. It's what's left when discipline burns away. In the logic of war, everything comes down to math, speed, altitude, ammunition, odds. But the moment Tucker pulled those triggers, the numbers stopped mattering. Because survival isn't statistical, it's personal, it's irrational. It's loud and bloody and laughing in the middle of fire. And that's why his legend endured long after his name disappeared from rosters. Not because he shot down 5 planes, but because he proved that, for one impossible morning over Schweinfurt, human instinct outgunned perfection. After the war, Tucker disappeared the way most airmen did. Not in glory, but in silence. The records list him discharged in 1945, no forwarding address, no interviews. He went home to a country that had already moved on, a world too busy rebuilding to remember how it had survived. He worked odd jobs, drank too much, talked too little. Once a neighbor said he woke screaming in the night, shouting coordinates into the dark. He never married, never joined the parades. For men like him, peace wasn't quiet. It was just the absence of engines. But in the archives, his story refused to die. Each time a new generation of pilots studied gun camera footage, his name resurfaced. The math of that day still defied belief. 5 kills, perfect arcs, impossible timing. Analysts decades later tried to simulate his gunnery pattern with modern systems. None could replicate it. There was something inhuman about how human it was. In the 401st Bomb Group's reunion book, his crew left one line beneath his name. He didn't aim, he just heard where they were. That sentence became his epitaph. Because what Tucker did wasn't luck. It was the moment when chaos and courage collided, when instinct, stripped of logic, became survival. The war created thousands of heroes, but few like him. Men whose greatness looked like madness, whose salvation came wrapped in smoke and whiskey. He never asked to be remembered, and maybe that's why he still is. Every time a historian watches that flickering film from Schweinfurt, they see more than bullets and metal. They see a man alone in a glass cage, laughing at death, fighting not because he believed he'd win, but because he refused to stop. Some legends live in medals. His lives in motion, the endless rhythm of twin 50s hammering against the odds, and somewhere over Europe, in the frozen air where the sky once burned with fire, you can still almost hear it. The roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, and one man laughing through the chaos. The war is over. The planes are gone. But the sky remembers. Because in that thin air above Schweinfurt, a half-drunk gunner once proved the oldest truth in combat. Discipline builds armies. Instinct wins wars.